Welcome to 30 Minutes of Faith. We're very happy to have the Reverend Dr. David Thompson with us, who is a longtime friend of the Interfaith community, a former president of the Board of Trustees. Welcome, David.
Thank you, sir.
Tell us where you were born and raised and where you grew up and those kinds of things.
I was born in Preston, England, in the north, cotton milling city and town, and spent the first 10 years of my life there, running outside and playing in the fields and generally enjoying myself, looking like a British schoolboy in shorts and riding my little green bike and raising hens in the backyard and that sort of thing.
And at 10 you went?
Well, we got on this big ship, the SS Sydney, and went over to Canada. It was just after the coronation of Elizabeth II, and we went to this completely new country. Sailed in eventually across some stormy seas to the port of Quebec. But the crew was on strike, so they wouldn't help us with the baggage, and my father was stuck with trying to get all the baggage off and crates off and everything. A really mad scramble. We eventually got it all off and helped a little 87-year-old Italian lady with her stuff, and we all got on the train and went to Montreal, and from Montreal to Port Hope. And from Port Hope to a family that took us in, sight unseen, gave us their home for about a month until we got our roots. That's how we began.
And you went to high school there and
No, I was at public school then, and got very sick actually with asthma, which took me out of school. And they didn't know quite where to put me between the British system and the Canadian system, so I sort of got up to about grade 6 in Port Hope and then moved to grade 8 in Toronto.
Do you speak French?
Un petit peu.
Oui.
Yeah, just a little, yeah.
Were you happy growing up?
Very much so, yeah. Other than the asthma, I was a pretty radiant child. I enjoyed myself. I loved life. Couldn't wait to get out of bed in the morning and go outside and play in the wonderful creation that surrounded me. I used to, in England, have a 100-yard garden with apple trees and chickens, and I loved to go out there and collect the eggs every day with my 2 little friends, and then go out and go into the farmer's field that was opposite where there was a huge chestnut tree, and we would knock the chestnuts down and then put them on a string and then play games with each other. Great, great childhood.
My great-grandfather grew up in England and then joined the Mormon Church and came to the United States. When he was about 40, he got called on a mission to go back, and they sent him back to the area where he'd been raised. But as a boy, he and his brother had stolen some apples from a man out of an apple orchard, and he was just going down that same lane. This is like, 35 years later. And the old man out there working his apple orchard, and he stopped him to tell him they had stolen apples when they were kids. And he said, well, okay, but you owe me $2 or what, 2 pounds, whatever it was. And he didn't have very much money. He had to give up most of what he had to pay off the apples. But he said his conscience was soothed and life was good again. Were you raised in a religious home?
Yes. My parents were Pentecostals. And and my father had a very interesting ministry of a choir that he used to take into British prisons. So we would go out on the weekends and always visit a prison and go and sing inside the prison. And I was too young at the beginning, so I'd always sit in the bus and wait for them to come out. And then we'd have fish and chips on the way home, so I thought that was pretty cool.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I have a sister.
And is she still living?
She is. She's in Toronto, and she's a medieval scholar, has a doctorate in that, and she's a professor.
Then how did you come to the United States?
I searched on the internet for a position that I thought would be good for me. And I had 18 criteria, and I searched the world, really. But one of them was to come to a capital city. And so as I was surfing, this one church showed up, and I looked at all its criteria and dismissed it at first. And then I went back and got out my 18 criteria and discovered that all 18 were in this one church.
Wow.
So I began to focus on that, and lo and behold, they called me.
And that was when?
That was the year of 2001, And I was ordained into the church 2 days before 9/11.
Wow.
And what was really amazing about that, on the advice of Dexter and others who used to be part of the Interfaith Service Bureau here, I invited all of the interfaith community to sit on the front dais of the church, and the presbytery were seated in the pews, which is really a reversal of order. Normally you'd have the presbytery in the front. But I wanted to send a message from the very beginning that this ministry was going to be about interfaith. And then lo and behold, 2 days later, 9/11 took place. And all of those fast new friends that I had made around the ordination ceremony, we were all together in the Cathedral of the Blessed Sacrament trying to make sense of 9/11. And that created an incredible bonding between the members of the faith community at that time. We came together, and it was a very beautiful thing, and still with us, of course.
Of course, and you're considered a key player in the Sacramento area. What were you doing between getting out of school and coming to the United States?
I worked for IBM for 2 years as a salesman. Was fully trained in the States here for that job. And that stood me in good stead in many ways, but I began to get restless about that, and then I thought, well, maybe my gifts would be better used in high school teaching, so I took a teaching degree.
That seems like it would be a natural.
Yeah, and I did English and theater, and then we mounted our own shows during that time at the school and in secular theater, and did that for 5 years. And then I moved into thinking very seriously about the ministry.
Where did you and your wife meet?
I actually met in a Presbyterian church where my father was the organist. And she and I would sing in the choir together, and we would then go out after the evening service, and I'd take her home or be with her, and so I got to know her that way.
Are you both still involved in music?
We are, and but always it's now more in the appreciation end than in the participation end. I did play the organ for a long time, for about 5 years in Canada, pipe organ. Still love it, and can still manage a hymn tune or two, but basically I've left that alone. Louise composes, and she writes her own stuff, and very gifted that way. She took on the idea of becoming an organist in order for me to always have a competent organist. So she became very, very good at that, and she actually played for the cathedral in Toronto, both the prelude and postlude at one point. So she was very, very capable. But then when I went into the ministry, I always ended up with the most fabulous musicians. So she just left it, which was very good of her.
Do you have children?
I adopted a boy, and he's grown up now, and he's in Canada.
Healthy? He's safe and...
He's safe and healthy, yep.
Good. Now, do you consider Sacramento to be a religious city? Or might I say, a spiritual city? That's a
very, very good question. I, of course, know the spiritual side of the city very, very well. And what I see here that's really fascinating is an integration between the state government and faiths together. And I think the faith communities have been through a lot together. So some of my best friends are people who are of completely different faith than me. And I think that's only possible because I think there is in Sacramento a spirituality which is deep, which crosses boundaries.
I like to hear you say it's deep. It feels that way when I go to other faiths on Saturday or Sunday, Friday night. They're devout and they believe with all their hearts. Where do you see God in our society?
In the poor, in the homeless, in the rejected, in those who are struggling to put out a state budget that works, in the struggle of life. And I always see God as kind of like a default and backstop. I see God, instead of being a great dominating deity, this deity that's always there for us but doesn't dominate us, lets us risk, lets us take opportunities together, backs us up, picks us up when we fall. That's the God I know.
Moral agency to choose and let us make choices.
And personal friend, too. A real sense that all of us can have this deep personal connection.
I think as I watch experience, you know, we couldn't have experience if we didn't make mistakes. It's how we gain experience.
Yes.
And, you know, religiously or spiritually, we all stumble and stagger a little. Do you think that sense of the poor and the heartbroken and the sad is growing, or is it sort of stable the way it's been for 1,000 years? How do you view that in our society?
I think it's growing. I think the gap between the rich and the poor is much greater than it has been. I think this recession is hard on many, many people. People that normally wouldn't be outside St. John's Shelter are now lining up for food. I really respect the Mormon tradition for their applesauce initiative to give that to the homeless and to set that example. And I see the Catholics providing a tremendous example in looking after people at Loaves and Fishes. But I see the lines are longer. I'm very concerned about the closing down of the mortgage crisis, which is now putting people into foreclosure, and people who never thought they would be homeless are homeless. We feed them every week at the Experience, which I run. We always feed the homeless, and that's new. You know, the food that we would normally bring for ourselves is now always shared. So these things are growing around us, and we need to have our eyes open to see what we can do to help them.
And does it feel like we're a little late and need to catch up, or are we we've recognized it and we've gone to work now?
I think we're sort of in between those two polarities. I think we have done some very good work. I think we've raised some awareness. I think that's primarily what religions do. But we've also gone further than that. We've opened up facilities for the homeless, and I'm really happy about those downtown churches that have opened their facilities so that people can have overnight shelter. I think that's basic. And I'm very glad to see the churches involved in doing that and providing leadership there. But there needs to be much more than that.
I know that last year the homeless were counted twice during the winter time, and I don't remember the exact number, but 4,000 something it seems like. And on one particular night, a couple were found that were dead. I don't mean a man and woman couple or a man. I meant, you know, two different people in two different places. But they wouldn't have even been found for a day or two if it just hadn't have been sort of the luck of the draw that they were being counted on that night.
Yes.
And that particular thing hit me kind of hard and made me
should hit all of us hard. You know, one of the things that I saw that really troubled me was a line of shoes in the St. John's Shelter belonging to little children as they'd taken their shoes off at night. This is sad. This is really sad.
Very. Tell us what else you're doing at the Experience.
The Experience is about 2 years old now, and its design is value added. It's one of the most exciting things I've ever tried to do. When we looked at the Interfaith picture in Sacramento, I asked myself, what do I think needs emphasis? And what will break down the walls between religions fastest and yet it's the hardest piece to do? The hardest piece is to actually worship together, to bring in someone of a different community. I was very excited just recently in the Cathedral of the Blessed Sacrament when we were remembering 9/11 to see the Sikh community in that cathedral giving their music to the whole community. And that's the sort of thing that the Interfaith Council is very good at doing. That's what I want to do every week at the Experience, bring in somebody. So we run a series of 4, and we'll bring in a speaker, a Jewish person or a Muslim or a Catholic or Latter-day Saints, whoever it is, and we will listen to them respectfully and listen to whatever there is in their faith that they can share, which is value-based. So holding the same values, I think, is very, very important. For instance, if we believe that we can reach God through prayer, it's very nice to have those traditions come in who believe in the power of prayer. Now, there are some traditions that I'm also concerned for atheists, but when I'm dealing with atheists, what I notice about them, if we have a disaster like Katrina, is that they want to stand up and be counted and bring food and supplies into that situation in New Orleans. And they have had their own website, and they said, you know, like, we're people too, which shows you that their values of human values are the same. And from my point of view as a Christian, all of us are valued in the eyes of God. And so I can value that atheist and say, okay, well, you don't believe as I do, but what do we have in common? And they really care about the poor and the homeless and disaster relief. So let's work with them on that.
Nicely said. Nicely said. Now, are the people who are attending the experience worshiping somewhere else and coming to that in addition to?
Yes.
Okay. And how is it being received?
It's being received very well. I worked very hard before we launched it so that it wouldn't be conceived as a threat to the faith communities. And I emphasized that we were interested in adding value only. So we do that. And I would say about 50% of the people that would show up already have a strong base in a faith community. And they're very happy to do both. So that's very exciting to me because that was the original conception.
And where do you meet and when do you meet?
We meet at Old St. Paul's at 15th and J at 4 o'clock every Sunday afternoon. This is the oldest church in Sacramento, and it's given to us by the Episcopalians. They're very gracious about it. And so we have this wonderful old space with a grand piano and an old tracker organ and magnificent stained glass windows. And there we meet God, and we meet God through various traditions. So we would have, for instance, Wali Amr would give the Muslim call to prayer at the beginning, and then some passage from the Quran might be read, and then something from the Hebrew Bible, and then something from the Christian New Testament, and then perhaps something from Buddhism or some other faith tradition that fits on the theme that we're dealing with. And for about 8 services, we did the theme of all of this discontinuity in society, all of this change that all of us are experiencing all the time. How do you handle uncertainty? So we did a series on that, and then pulled from the various traditions as to how they handled uncertainty within the various traditions. And what came out was quite wonderful. There are some fabulous jewels in each of the traditions.
Absolutely.
And you know, you can pull it out and polish it off, give it its own space, and let it glow. It doesn't have to remain locked up in some little church or in some little institution. It can be brought out and shared. And that's what the experience, that's why I'm excited.
And is this being done elsewhere, or is this something that sort of came to you?
My original conception was based on that idea of trying to meet a need in Sacramento. But since then, about 3 months ago, we joined the United Religions Initiative, which is worldwide. It was based out of San Francisco, developed by Bishop Swing. So Swing's vision was that there would be a parliament of world religions, that there would be something equivalent to the United Nations where all the religions of the world came together. Now that has morphed a little bit over the years into what he calls circles of cooperation. So the circles of cooperation adhere to the charter, which is set out in the United Religions Initiative, and then you do your own thing. So if you can agree with the charter, which we do, then we're allowed to do our own thing. So what I would like to do is franchise the experience in city after city. And once I really get the model working, then I'll seek to be able to move it, say, to San Francisco next, and then maybe to Oakland, and then maybe Roseville, until there is an experience in every city where people can always worship together once a week across the faiths, and serve together across the faith, and develop relationships with things like the Interfaith Council in Greater Sacramento, which is doing interfaith work, and work with the homeless that the Catholics are doing. So it's sort of, the vision is that it would be a place where we would worship and serve together and bolster understanding and build bridges between the faith communities.
Sounds like a good approach. Do you think there are more good people left on the earth than bad?
Yes.
And does that apply in Sacramento and California as well as the rest of the world?
I think the difficult people are mostly fear and hatred driven. And I think they're a small percentage, but they get all the news.
Boy, that's well said. We talked about that earlier today, actually, that the bad guys get all the press and the good people just go on doing well.
Yeah.
How much longer will you do this? You're going to do this till you take your last breath?
You know, I haven't been able to predict my life so far, so I don't know. It feels good to the indefinite future.
It's a good work.
It's a great work. It's very meaningful.
How do you see personal, private, religious pulled in to a person versus the congregation, and you're teaching and preaching to 300 sitting there?
You know, I think pastors frequently fall into a role and lose themselves in the role. And I think it's a real danger for spiritual teachers. So the challenge is to remain authentically yourself, up front, which means you've really got to know yourself. And once you know yourself, then you can be yourself in front of your people with all of your hang-ups and with all of your strengths and weaknesses, so that they can say, well, that guy's a human being up there, instead of just trying to always be proper and politically correct and so on. Those are the stressors that affect pastors. The only answer that I know of is to be yourself.
And that's a good trait, to be true to yourself. Did you see the movie Pollyanna?
No.
You know, I've never read the book. I've threatened to do that 100 times. But in the movie, you know, the minister would pound the pulpit and scare the daylights out of everybody, and then he would give the sermon that Aunt Polly, who ran the town, wanted sermonized. And the little, you know, Pollyanna comes to town and tries to convince everybody to just be themselves. What you see is what you get. And she wears everybody down eventually, and, you know, it all works out. But Carl Malden played the role of the minister in that. It was a favorite movie of mine when I was growing up. And boy, he'd just pound on the pulpit and shake his finger, and everybody would, oh no, this is what I've got to do. And then the little girl brought in, can't you just tell us about the goodness and the sweetness and the love and, you know, all of those other sorts of things. I always felt good about that. What are the key issues in Sacramento in our faith community as you see them? Where do we really need to focus? You know, a man said to me one time, list 10 that you need to work on number 1. Once you can take it off the list, move everything up, put another one back in the bottom. But you can only do 1 or 2. I mean, most people have the ability.
That's right.
You can't do 10 of them. So where do you see the issues of faith that we need to be working with?
We need to really look very hard at the background issues. What's driving a lot of the issues, whether it's recognized or not, is climate change. Sacramento is the second most vulnerable city after New Orleans. We live behind levees. We need disaster preparedness, and every faith community needs to be right up there on that. No question about it. Homelessness. Our people who are homeless live behind levees in the park system. And they could probably teach us a lot about survival. But that homelessness problem is getting worse, and the churches need to be concerned about that. The jobs refrain that we hear politically applies to Sacramento. And in order to really make Sacramento work, we have to strengthen the government in Sacramento instead of knocking it down and criticizing it all the time. We need to strengthen the government in its right and good functions, because we are a government town and a government city. When the government prospers, people are employed. When the government's knocked down, doesn't have enough revenue to carry on, then people are furloughed, and the whole city hits a depression. So part of Sacramento's success is to become a champion of appropriately sized state government. And that's a new concept for some people, to think that the government could do anything good. I support taxes, I support the government, and I believe that we need the government to act on our behalf many, many times. And so I'd like to see a strong government, a fair government, and I'd like to see government representatives that were connected into the faith community in a value-based way. People like Steinberg are wonderful lights to me in this community. There's a man who's a Jewish man, and he's part of the synagogue life, but he's also involved in the life and welfare of the city. We have more politicians who are like that, and that's the kind of politicians we need. On the federal level, with Doris Matsui, has the same kind of concern. The fact that she would come to the interfaith community and talk about her childhood, what it felt like to be a refugee, and to know that that conscience is also represented at the federal level, to me is exciting. So Sacramento's a government town. Let's make our government work.
Now, the Corps of Engineers have been doing some work on the levees, and, you know, we see action going on up and down the river. So hopefully we'll get those repaired. How are we going to overcome homelessness?
One family at a time, picking them up one family at a time, loving them, nurturing them, making sure they have shelter first, taking them to the appropriate agencies. But it's going to be one family at a time, John. There's no single program that is going to work for everybody. There's not one shoe fits all here. We've tried that approach. You know, San Francisco is doing some interesting stuff at the protest level. They're saying, look, we've got all these empty homes that have been foreclosed. We've got far more empty homes than the homeless people. What would it take to make the mental switch to say, you know, if a person's homeless, perhaps we can work out something with some of these empty homes? And that would require coordination. It would require agencies. But there's no single size that fits everything. So my answer, one family at a time.
I've spent a fair amount of time with the homeless in the last several years, and one of the things that I observe is 10 years ago we viewed the homeless as either extremely poor, or they were abused and they were on the run somewhere, or they were drug addicts, or they were the weird wild. And these days a great percentage of the homeless are people who are just displaced. They're just
Right.
displaced, and they need help, and I hope we can overcome that. If you could wave a magic wand, stand up and say, this is going to fix one specific thing, what would that be?
I really am upset between the connection between religions and violence. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would love to see the religions distance themselves from violence and build bridges towards one another. And if that happened overnight, it would be wonderful. The community we have in Sacramento is a world example of how religions can get along together. It's very exciting to be part of it. It's the most exciting thing for me in Sacramento. So if we can work on that huge problem of the connection between religion and violence and wave a magic wand over that so that religions, instead of being fighting one another, were cooperating with one another, we would have achieved something quite wonderful.
Why are people being violent?
Fear, hatred, ideology, feeling that this is what God wants.
My way or the highway?
My way or the highway. Yeah.
The victims are more victimized, it seems to me, than even 10 or 15 years ago. It keeps getting a little worse and a little
Which is
worse.
why we need more and more love in every faith community. We need to go the second mile, turn the cheek, reach into our pockets for a handout, for a hand up.
And love is spoken here.
And love is spoken here.
That would be a wonderful thing. It's nice to visit with you. Way to go on the work you're doing. You're to
Thank you,
be
John.
commended for doing that. Keep doing it, please.
And you too.
Okay. Thank you very much for being with us. It's been a pleasure to visit with you.
Thank you, John.